Hello, welcome to our ongoing survey of Genesis. This is lesson 14, and I've entitled the lessons Chickens Come Home to Roost, part 1. If you looked at the lesson from last week that Richard presented, you know that he set the stage for complications and dysfunction and things that are going to happen in Jacob's life that are teed up by decisions that are made by Jacob, by Rebekah, by Isaac. And we're going to start looking at some of those details today in what will end up being a 4-part series as we look at Jacob's life. And then we're going to transition into Joseph and finish out Genesis with Joseph's story and the end of Jacob's story. And of course, a lot of that is redemption story, which is the way that God works with us. Even when we are making bad decisions, He is there to redeem us. So as we think about this topic, this chickens come home to roost, I selected this cartoon. It says, well, I hope you're happy, Muriel. They're home and they're ready to roost. Of course, that idiom, that saying, the chickens will come home to roost, there are other similar sayings such as what goes around comes around, or you'll reap what you sow, which is a biblical idiom. They're all saying the same thing, which is to say that there are generally consequences for the bad decisions that we make. And we make a bad decision, there's going to be repercussions most often in life. And we find that to be true. And as we're going to be thinking about Jacob over the next 4 weeks, this week plus the next 3 lessons, we want to be thinking about some of Jacob's characteristics. You know, what is his character and what are some of his tendencies? Because we all have characteristics and we all have tendencies that we have to watch out for. And we have strengths and we have weaknesses, which is why we have people around us to help balance our strengths and weaknesses. And you see with most of our biblical heroes that that's what they do. They surround themselves with people they can trust that balance out their strengths and weaknesses. But the patterns that we're going to watch out for with Jacob is that Jacob tends to be passive rather than proactive. And we saw that in the last lesson when he allows Rebekah to influence him to deceive his brother and to steal the birthright, and then to conspire to steal the blessing, right? And so he tends to be passive and let other people kind of guide him down a path that's probably not the best path, where he should probably be more proactive and say, no, that's not the direction that I want to go. He tends to proceed from a human perspective rather than a godly perspective when he makes decisions. And we see that a lot with our Bible heroes, where they are, just like we are, tempted to think in human terms and to make decisions based on a human perspective, such as it's important to be the oldest son, or to have the birthright, or to have the status in the family, because along with status comes power, and along with power comes the ability to make things happen, get things done. And we all sort of think that way, don't we, right? But God has a different perspective, and God is able to work His plans regardless of human power or despite human power. And often He's actually looking for the opposite. He's looking for us to be humble and to show His power through our weaknesses. There's absolutely no reason that God couldn't work His plan to redeem humanity through someone other than the firstborn. So there wasn't a necessity for Jacob to grasp that status within the family in order to exercise God's perfect plan. In fact, God's going to exercise His perfect plan through the 4th-born son of Leah, Judah, instead of the firstborn son, Reuben, or Simeon, or Levi. So God's able to work His plan regardless of our power, our status, our wealth. Jacob tends to trust in temporal power and wealth rather than godly power and wealth. And so he's tempted to put his trust in that and to make decisions based on human wealth and power and status. And then when we think about these chickens that come home to roost, Jacob tends to complain about the roosting chickens more often than repenting about those decisions. And so when the consequences come around, rather than saying, I really wish that I had made a different choice, I'm going to learn from that lesson, he just complains about the roosting chickens. But we also have to bear in mind that while Jacob is a flawed man and a flawed husband and a flawed father, he still has a heart for God. And he demonstrates that over and over again And because of his heart for God, similar to the heart that David had for God, God continues to work with Jacob. He continues to mold Jacob. He continues to redeem Jacob from his bad decisions. And he reminds us that God is willing to work his perfect plan through one more imperfect man. And praise God for that he's able and willing to do that. One thing that I thought was important as we think about this story, we need to think about where Jacob is in his life journey. And speaking of chickens, Jacob is no spring chicken. He is 77 years old when this story takes place. So he's halfway through his life, which also means that Esau is 77 years old. Notice that Isaac dies when he's 120 years old, right? So if Esau, which we'll find that Esau plans to kill his brother Jacob because of the deception Richard mentioned in his story last week, that if Esau's going to wait till Isaac dies in order to execute his plan, he's got 43 years to wait until that happens. A lot of things can happen in 43 years. Of course, neither Jacob nor Esau know how long their father Isaac has to live. But it turns out that he's still got a lot of time left. The other thing is that, from my perspective, if you're a 77-year-old man, that's a long time to be living with mom and dad. He probably should have moved his tent out of the Isaac and Rebekah tent a long time ago. And so a lot of the problems that Jacob's having probably come from the fact that he's been living at home way too long. Well, there may be a lesson for our current generation there too, but we'll let that one sit. Jacob's age is something to keep in mind as this story unfolds, because we shouldn't have the perception that this romance that happens is between a young man and a young woman. This is somebody who's very much middle-aged, based on the amount of time that people live in this era. So you might think of him being equivalent to a 50-year-old man today, but nevertheless, he's definitely not a young man. So keep that in context as we look at this story. So Jacob needs a wife. Probably he should have had a wife well before he was 77, but at this point in life, he needs a wife for sure if he's going to establish his line and live up to the expectation that everyone has for him to follow Abraham's promise to create this dynasty from his perspective, right? And this is very similar to the situation that Abraham had when he wanted Isaac to have a wife. And so Abraham set a pattern for how you go get a wife for your son when you're living in a society that doesn't have good matches for your son, because they're living in Canaan. They're surrounded by Japhethites, descendants from Japheth, and they're Semites, descendants from Shem. And so Abraham wants a wife for Isaac that's going to be from their family line, and presumably a wife that knows the one true God. And so he's going to want a wife for Isaac from his family, from his homeland. And so this is what Abraham does. Abraham goes to his most trusted servant. He goes to the head of the household, the person that he entrusts his business affairs, the operation of their entire enterprise and the family. And he charges his servant with going back to Abraham's homeland, back to Padan Aram, to select a wife for Isaac. And it's a serious charge. He doesn't just give him the directions. He makes him swear an oath to go do that. And it's important to understand that this servant that he entrusted, because he would have been in charge of all of Abraham's dealings, all of his enterprise, his family, he would have been an expert negotiator, especially with people who did not believe in the one true God. So they may not have had integrity that you would expect from somebody who followed God. So he's an expert negotiator. He's trusted servant. And so Abraham says, I'm going to send you back home to find a wife for Isaac. He also assures the servant that God is going to be involved in this, that there's an angel going to go ahead of him to set this up, right? That he's not going to be doing this on his own. He's going to have help from God, however that turns out. But he also says to the servant, if God doesn't provide, and remember that throughout Abraham's life, from Abraham's perspective, there's been times where God did provide, and there's times when God didn't. And by this time, Abraham's learned to trust in God and not necessarily take matters into his own hands. He says, I'm going to let you out of your oath if God doesn't provide, right? So, that gives the servant an understanding that he's going to go do this job, but, he's not bound by that oath for life. It's a job that he needs to do, and ultimately it's to God to provide. But notice that he says unequivocally, don't take Isaac back home, right? I don't want my son to go back home. And we don't know exactly why he's so insistent on that. Part of it is most likely that he doesn't want his son to be exposed to the people that are living back there, the heathen people that are living there, the customs that they may have. He probably knows his kinfolk well enough to know that they may have a negative influence on Isaac. Most likely he wants to keep him home and under his influence. But whatever the reason is, he's very insistent that this is not Isaac's job to select the wife. This is your job. And so don't take him now and don't take him later. So the way that the story unfolds, and we're not going to read all the scriptures, but you can see that they're going to be here, is the servant departs to go select the wife for Isaac. And he's got these bride price gifts, because in the ancient times, if you're going to select a bride, then you have to pay a dowry. You have to pay a price for the bride to the father of the bride or the household that the bride belongs to. And the question that we sort of have as we think about this is, how's the servant going to pick the wife for Isaac? Abraham didn't give him any instructions other than saying God was going to provide. And so is the servant is he going to have a beauty pageant? Is he going to have an auction? Is he going to have some sort of, exam? What's he going to do to select an appropriate wife for the only son of his master, right? And so the way that the servant proceeds is kind of reminiscent of Gideon. Remember Gideon asked for a very specific sign when God asked him to lead his army in the time after Joshua. This servant asked God for a very specific sign. He says, I'm going to sit here at this well, and what I want to see a woman who comes to the well, draws water, and then offers to give me a drink of water and also to feed my camels that I have with me. And in this respect, the servant relies completely on God to not only provide the wife for Isaac, but to do the evaluation of that woman. And he's going to be passive in that and wait for that door to open, that sign to come from God. And so that's what he does. He sits there and watches, and he waits to see what happens. He makes this request to God, please provide this sign of this woman who's going to give me a drink and give my camels a drink. And so God responds immediately. Before he'd even finished speaking, behold, Rebekah shows up on the scene. And then she proceeds to behave precisely according to the sign that the servant had asked for. That she draws water, and the servant says, can I have a drink? And she says, drink, my Lord. And then not only does she offer to quench his thirst, she turns around and says, I will draw water for your camels also until they have finished drinking. And then when the camels had finished drinking, the servant took a gold ring weighing half a shekel and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels and presented that to her. He greets her, he blesses her, and most importantly, before anything else happens, the servant bows his head and worships the Lord. He said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who's not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. Not only demonstrating his gratitude for God for giving him the sign, he demonstrates to Rebekah his worship of the one true God and creates that sign for her of what kind of man he is. He also gives credit where credit is due. There's no mention here of Rebekah's characteristics, that she's beautiful or that she's intelligent or that she is of good character, because it isn't evident to the servant, it's evident to God. But the servant is relying on God to evaluate and select Rebekah. And so that's exactly what happens. And then we're going to be done with this part of the story. It continues in chapter 24, lots of detail about how the servant negotiates successfully to not only have Rebekah be Isaac's bride, but to bring her back to Isaac. And you see the wisdom of Abraham selecting his servant to do that negotiation and how well he does it. But we're going to take a look right here, because this gives us a little peek into what's going to happen when Jacob repeats this process of selecting a bride and how Rebekah's brother Laban fits into that story. It says, Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, he invited the man to come. It tells us a little bit about Laban, doesn't it? That the first thing that he noticed was the jewelry that his sister Rebekah had on her. That this was not just some ordinary day at the oasis. Rebekah's coming back with some prized jewelry, and that's the first thing Laban saw, right? Well, it's going to tell us a little bit about how Laban responds later on. He's got something in his mind about Abraham and his line, that they might be a source of income for him. The other thing that we see is that even now, while Rebekah's father is still alive, Laban is speaking for the family. In fact, the only time we ever hear from Rebekah's father is when both Laban and her father concede to the marriage, later down in chapter 24. So for whatever reason, Laban is kind of running the show, even at this point. But the servant negotiates expertly with Laban, and he returns back to Abraham with Rebekah to be Isaac's bride. And of course, at the end of 24, we see the story that Isaac's very pleased and comforted, and because his mom has passed away, he's got a woman in his life the way it's supposed to be, and he's able to leave his family and cleave to his wife, and it's a romantic and successful story, and the pattern worked. And now Isaac and Rebekah are back home in the shelter and protection of Abraham's family, worshiping the one true God and being able to continue in the pattern that Abraham and Sarah had set for them. So far, so good, right? The pattern is set. So now let's go to our story, now that we've kind of looked back and seen the pattern that Abraham set. Genesis chapter 28, it says, Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and directed him, You must not take a wife from the Canaanite women, so similar to Abraham. Arise, go to Paddan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take as your wife from there one of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So it's a good start in that Isaac recognized, just like Abraham, his father, that Jacob needed a Semite wife who presumably knows and worships the one true God, presumably. But then Isaac departs from the pattern, and instead of selecting a servant, an emissary, a negotiator, and equipping them with a bride price and sending them off to find that wife, he says to Jacob, you need to go pick your wife and take one of the daughters of Bethuel, or the sisters of Laban, to be your wife. So why did Isaac depart from this proven pattern, the one that had worked for him, the one that his father had set? Well, we have to back up a few verses to see why he might have done that. You see, after Jacob deceived Esau into giving away his blessing, you remember that story. It says that Esau hated Jacob, which it's hard to blame Esau at this point for being really upset, because this is twice that Jacob has deceived him, right? And it says he hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him, being Jacob, and maybe even the blessing that Jacob had given Esau, because it's not a great blessing. And Esau said to himself, the days of my mourning for my father are approaching, and then I will kill my brother Jacob. So he's saying that I think Dad's close to passing away, and as soon as Dad's gone, I'm gonna kill my brother for what he's done. So Rebekah hears of Esau's plot. He tells Jacob he should go see his good uncle Laban. Flee, get away, give Esau time to get over his hatred. That's what she has in mind for him, is to rather confront his mistake rather than deal with the family conflict. It's to hit the road and go to see Uncle Laban and hide out for a while. And it's interesting to me that she doesn't have the same concern that Abraham had for Isaac in sending her son back to the homeland, whatever those concerns were. But Abraham was very specific that it wasn't in Isaac's best interest to go back. And it's interesting that Rebekah didn't have that same concern. And then at the very end, she plants this seed with Isaac. It's a different message, because she's not saying that she thinks that Jacob needs to leave because he's in danger from Esau, But she sort of provides a different reasoning. She says, Rebekah said to Isaac, I loathe my life because of the Hittite women. If Jacob marries one of the Hittite women like these, one of the women of the land, what good will my life be? So she's saying to Isaac, it's time for Jacob to have a wife, but it's not appropriate for him to marry one of these women. She's already told Jacob she wants him to head back. And so that's how Isaac kind of puts two and two together. And when he comes to Jacob to direct him on what to do, it's with the influence of Rebekah echoing in his mind once again. And so that's how Jacob ends up on the path to head back to Haran. So what does that journey look like? They're starting down here in the southern part of the Holy Land. So if you look at present-day Israel, they're down here in the Negev area. So, Dead Sea here, desert area here. This is where they're hanging out. This is about 500-mile journey back up to Haran, so no inconsequential journey when you're traveling by camel. This is the same route that Abraham would have sent his servant on to go back and find Isaac's wife, Rebekah. And so Jacob's going to follow that path. And some interesting things happen on the way that Richard talked about, the dream that Jacob had on the way. But it's a long trip. And when he arrives, you're going to have a scene that's kind of reminiscent of the scene you saw with Moses meeting Jethro's daughter Zipporah for the first time. That there's a well and there's sheep and there's a gathering. And so Jacob meets these servants at their watering place in chapter 29. And unlike Abraham's head servant, who when he shows up and meets people, he immediately takes a very retrospective approach. He observes, right? Well, Jacob gets all up in their business. He sees the people coming, the shepherds coming with the sheep, and he says, look, it's not time to be watering the sheep, right? You guys need to be pasturing the sheep and then watering them later. So he's giving them advice on how they should take care of their flock. He asks them where they come from. They say that they're from Haran, so he knows he's in the right place. And he asks about Laban. He says, how is Laban doing? And they say he's doing well. And in fact, they say his daughter Rachel is coming right now with her sheep, right? And so the scene is set, but in a different way, right? Because Jacob is interacting with, and instead of asking God to present him with his wife, he's, in this case, being proactive. If you think about this scene at the well, here's what a well might have looked like. This is an illustration from some artifacts, some work that's been done in eastern Turkey, unearthing some of these ancient sites. And the well would have had a large stone on top to protect the water from evaporation and also from contamination. You can draw water from the well with bucket type device, and then either pour it straight into the trough for the livestock to drink or pour it into a jar to take home. So this might be the kind of well that they're coming around. And so one thing that's obvious with the kind of size trough that you're looking at here is that the shepherds would need to orchestrate the sheep coming through. They have to know what they're doing, right? So they don't really need Jacob to be telling them what to do. And most likely, just like with Zipporah, you're going to have to wait your place in line. And so Jacob jumps in and takes control, right? Rachel shows up just like Rebekah. At the moment that Jacob is asking about Laban, asking about, is he in the right place, when it would have been perfect timing for him to have asked God for a sign. God, if you want me to have a wife, bring her to me, right? And whatever his request might have been, God might have delivered on that. But instead of doing that, Jacob takes this as a time to show off, right? He sees Rachel, and similar to Moses, he's going to intervene, and he says, I'm going to take the stone off the well, and I'm going to have Rachel's sheep up front and let them be watered. And so he kind of shows off for Rebekah and maybe puts these other shepherds in their place. I don't know all of what he had in mind, but it worked. And Rachel's impressed, and she runs back to Laban and says, hey, I've met your kinfolk, your cousin in this case, and Laban seems really super excited. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he ran to meet him. wonder why Laban was so excited to meet Jacob. Maybe he's thinking the cash register might be ringing again. You know, it's worked for me once, it might work out for me again. And so Jacob returns to Haran, and once again, departing from the pattern, rather than getting straight to the point of why he's there, he stayed with him a month. So he kind of settles in. And we have to ask the question, why would he do that? Why would he settle in? And there's probably two reasons. One is that he, in the back of his mind, has the idea that Esau is out to kill him. And his mom had warned him that he needed to stay here for a while. So he's probably settling in to avoid Esau. But the other thing he doesn't have is the bride price. Isaac didn't provide him with the dowry, and so he doesn't really have anything to negotiate with, and it doesn't seem like he's a very good negotiator. So, let's think for just a minute. Imagine how things might have been different if Isaac and Jacob had followed the pattern that Abraham set. What if Isaac had picked that trusted servant, equipped him with the dowry, sent him back here to find the wife for Isaac, and that servant had done the same thing that Abraham's servant had done, which is to ask God for the sign? How might this story have been different? Because it seems, from what we can tell, that Rachel would have been a good fit for Jacob. Not only is she beautiful, she's good with sheep. It seems to me like she's a hardworking woman who takes her family's needs seriously, and so she's pitching in and helping by being a shepherd. And it's possible that Rachel is a potential Proverbs 31 kind of woman. And that from this scene, if they would have negotiated the bride price and Jacob headed back to Rebekah and Isaac, that you'd have another Rebekah and Isaac story. And God could have worked his plan through Jacob and Rachel, perhaps through Joseph, to bring the Messiah into the world. It could have been that way, right? But we'll never know, because that outcome is not to be. And from this point, we're going to see some of that dysfunction and some of the chickens coming home to roost. Although I believe God certainly could have worked his will through Jacob and Rachel union without Leah being part of the picture, that didn't happen. And so it's only conjecture on my part that maybe Joseph could have been the chosen one to bring a Messiah into the world. But as it turns out, and we're about to see how this comes to be, God will work his plan through Jacob and Leah instead of Jacob and Rachel. And that descendant of Jacob's is going to be Judah, not even the firstborn, not Reuben, not Simeon, not Levi. It's going to be Judah that is going to bring that kingly line into existence that's going to produce David and ultimately our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And so we're going to see how that happens. It happens because of decisions that are made by both Jacob and by Laban and by Rachel and Leah. As we follow in our chapter 29, Laban draws Jacob into his web. And he says to him, you're my kinsman. You're not a guest, you're not a slave, but I want you to be a hired hand. And as kinsman, he really should be guest. But Laban's suggesting that he ought to join the enterprise and work for Laban, which is going to create a hierarchy that shouldn't have existed. Jacob uses this opportunity to negotiate a bride price that he wants to pay for Rachel because he loves Rachel. She's attractive, she's beautiful, and he's fallen in love. And so he says to Laban, I'll work for you for 7 years and be your hired hand in order to earn the right to have Rachel as my wife. And remember, Jacob's 77, so the negotiation is going to give Rachel an 84-year-old husband. I don't have any idea how old Rachel is, but she's going to have, like I said, not a spring chicken for a husband, but Jacob loves her. And after knowing her for a month, we're going to presume that he loves her primarily because of her good looks, that she's attractive. That's what attracted him to her in the first place. We're going to give credit to Rachel for being more than just a pretty face, partly because of, as I said before, the way she was taking care of her family and pitching in and doing the work. But we don't really know. It also says that by comparison, Leah wasn't attractive. It says her eyes were weak. That word can also mean soft, which we're not exactly sure if that means that she had poor eyesight and therefore was unable to do the same things that Rachel was able to do, that she was kind of maybe tent-bound or something. Or it may mean that her eyes weren't attractive. And back then, when women would typically wear veils or they would be wearing something that covered most of their face, just like our experience over the past 3 years, your eyes take on added importance, right? Your expression comes from them, and a woman's beauty might be primarily sort of shown by her eyes. So whatever it is, the eyes are an important part of why Jacob is attracted to Rachel and doesn't see Leah in the same light. So, verse 20, the negotiation is done. Jacob's going to work 7 years to have Rachel's hand. And it says, so Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days because of the love that he had for her. It's such a sweet, romantic verse, and it probably resonates with all romantics, that's our experience, right? That when we're in love, the time seems to fly. And if you've ever been in a long-distance romance, you know that time really flies when you're together and it drags when you're not. And so Jacob's experience is that 7 years goes by in a flash, even though he's going to be 84 years old. And so after the 7 years, he comes to Laban and says, I've done my job. I've earned the right to have Rachel, so now is the time. And so, as was the custom in ancient times, Laban's going to organize a big wedding feast and invite all of the town and his relatives, and everybody's going to come around, and they're going to have a great big feast. And unfortunately, we know what can happen at great big feasts, right? Not only is there a ton of food, but there's a ton of wine, and so the wine is flowing, which might be part of the explanation for how what happened. That's just my conjecture. It's also probably one of the reasons that Abraham was determined not to have Isaac go back here, is that the way that they conducted business wasn't the way that God-fearing people would conduct business, right? So anyway, there's this big feast. And because of the feast, the way that this proceeds, the end of the feast is going to be dark, it's going to be nighttime, and so Laban, the shrewd man that he is, subs in Leah for Rachel and provides her in Jacob's tent instead of Rachel. It also says that he provides a handmaid to Leah, and it isn't evident whether he does that right at this moment or whether that happens after, but at any rate, Leah is going to come along with a handmaid whose name is Zilpah. And this is really the supreme irony of this entire lesson, right? The supreme irony is that when Jacob wakes up and realizes that his new wife isn't Rachel, he's outraged. And he goes immediately to Laban and he complains to him and says, "Did I not serve with you for Rachel? Then why have you deceived me?" The consummate deceiver, the brother that deceived his own brother twice, is now complaining to Laban. The chickens have come home to roost, and Jacob is complaining bitterly. And so right here at this point, it's decision time for Jacob. He has a wife and his wife has a handmaid. What Isaac sent him to do has been done. He still has to think about Esau. It's been 7 years, but that's in the back of his mind, no doubt. So, do you negotiate further, or do you take your new wife and head for Canaan? Remember that Leah is the one that provides Jacob with his first sons, including Judah, who's going to be the one that establishes the tribe of Judah from which David and Jesus comes. So God could have worked his plan from this point the way that he wanted. It's another fork in the road moment that could have changed the trajectory of Jacob's character arc. But Jacob makes a different decision. He follows the path of romance. He follows the path of his love for Rachel. And the end result is he's going to have 4 women in his tents. He's going to have Rachel and Leah as wives, and their 2 handmaids. They're going to be in the mix as well. And things are about to get really complicated and really dysfunctional from this point on. We're going to see that over the next 3 lessons. But I think it's time to think about, what are we going to learn from this lesson? Because it's a fascinating story. It's fascinating to think about what's about to happen. But there's also some things there for us to learn, right? One of them I put at the top of the list is that we should not presume that man's way is God's way. One of the things we learn from these amazing patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is that they have this tendency consistently to be thinking of, how am I going to accomplish what God wants me to accomplish the way that man would do things? Through position and power and status. And often the mistakes they make are because they're presuming that they have to do things man's way in order to accomplish God's mission. The reality is that God will work his plan with us, through us, or despite us. And he's in control, and things are going to happen according to his will. And when we make mistakes and commit sins, it's not going to deter him from his plan, but he may end up working despite us instead of with us, which isn't the way that we want to work. We can definitely and are obligated to learn from the successes and failures of those who go before us. With our Bible heroes that we see in the Bible, such as Jacob and the mistakes that he makes, they're there for us to learn from. They're there for us to say, well, I don't want to do things that way, for sure. But it also even works in our own lives, that we have the opportunity to see other people around us that are doing things the right way. And we can determine that we want to do things the right way. We can see people making mistakes. And we can determine that we don't want to make those same mistakes. And we can see people being redeemed from the mistakes that they make and the sins they commit, and know that we have the potential to be redeemed as well. But these are all there for us to learn from. And if we don't, then we just run the risk of making the same mistakes over and over again instead of learning. Human perspective is often superficial. Jacob shows up and he falls in love with Rachel because she's a beautiful woman. He's apparently not looking deeper at her character and the things that make her the woman that she is, maybe. But we do know that our perspective is often superficial, and we're looking at things that are on the surface and making decisions about things that are not deeper. God's perspective is spiritual. He's looking beyond the superficial, beyond the way that we look or the money that we have or the lifestyle that we live, and judging our heart. And really, God's the one that can judge the heart. And so Abraham's servant showed the pattern we should have, which is, let's ask God to help us make decisions, to have a spiritual perspective, to not be just looking at things that are on the surface and superficial. Which means that I think it's proper for us to pray for open doors, especially at consequential times in our life. To say to God, I'm going to be still and wait, and I'm going to look for an open door, and I'm going to pray for an open door. And if you have that open door, then to be proactive at responding to the open door that's before you. But also to recognize that God's answer may be to not have an open door, to close the doors in front of you, and that that's the right answer as well. Which means that sometimes retreat is the absolute best decision that you can make. There are times when you're presented with a closed door or a challenge, and the right thing is to step back and let God do the work, rather than jumping headlong into something that's going to get you into a real mess and into trouble. So what Jacob seems unable to do is to move back at the right times and move forward at the right times, and it causes him great difficulty. When you do have an open door, that calls for worship and gratitude and credit to God. That He opens the door in front of you and you respond. That's not because you responded, that's because God opened the door in front of you and provided the opportunity. And we do see Jacob doing that from time to time too. We certainly see that with Abraham and Isaac. And then the last thing that I think we have to learn from this lesson is the reason I titled the lesson what I titled it. The chickens do come home to roost. Things that go around come around, and what you sow you'll often reap, which means there are consequences for the mistakes that we make, the sins that we commit. And life just teaches us that reality. You make a mistake, you're often going to suffer a consequence. You commit a sin, you're often going to suffer a consequence. And even if the consequence isn't a temporal consequence, that you don't lose money or you're not disadvantaged, there's an impact to your heart, there's an impact to your spirit. Fortunately, we serve a God who makes up for consequences, that He redeems us from bad decisions, that He makes up for the sins that we commit and brings us back into a relationship with Him. And we're going to see that He does that in Jacob's life over and over and over again, which gives us the hope that the many mistakes that I make in my life, He's going to be there for me and redeem me from those as long as my heart's open to it. That's the message from Jacob. It's a message from the rest of Genesis. And I look forward to doing the next 3 lessons with you and then seeing this through, because it is the ultimate redemption story and ends in our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, in whom we have hope for eternal life. Next week, if you would reach Genesis chapter 30 in preparation for that lesson.